June 18th, 1943. The hot Texas sun beat down as a long convoy of Pullman cars screeched to a halt at a rural station. Inside, nearly 2,000 German prisoners pressed their faces to the dusty glass, bracing themselves for the America they had been promised in Nazi broadcasts. Weak, starving, collapsing. But what they saw was the opposite. Green fields of cotton and wheat rolled across the horizon. Massive barns dwarfed the factories of their hometowns. Windmills turned lazily above orchards heavy with fruit. This was not poverty. This was abundance. Obergefreiter Hans Birkner later scribbled in a hidden diary, "We were told America was crumbling, that it was ruled by criminals, its people starving. But here, every field is full of life. They lied to us. They lied about everything. The trains screeched to a stop. The prisoners tensed, expecting curses, stones, perhaps the fury of families who had lost sons in battle. Instead, they found silence. On the platform stood townsfolk farmers in overalls, women with children clinging to their skirts, boys waving small flags. They stared, not with hatred, but with curiosity. One farmer lifted his son onto his shoulders and whispered, "Those are the Germans." The guards shouted orders, but their voices were calm. The prisoners shooled down into the heat, expecting snarls of dogs, barbed cages, the hunger of punishment. Instead, they smelled something strange, fresh bread drifting from a bakery across the street. Private Carl Heller remembered, "When I stepped onto American soil, I thought of chains and darkness. Instead, I smelled bread, real bread, and I realized this captivity was not the captivity I imagined." The convoy of trucks waited. As the Germans climbed aboard, they looked back one last time at the silent crowd. No one spat. A few even nodded. It was disorienting, friendlier than any prisoner had expected. The trucks bounced along dusty roads, leaving the town behind. Through the wooden slats, the Germans saw a landscape alive with prosperity grain silos, tractors, cattle herds stretching as far as the eye could see. Many came from German villages where rationing ruled life, where blackout curtains cloaked every home, where bread was scarce. Yet here, in a country fighting on two fronts, life seemed untouched, effortless. One diary entry captured the thought bluntly, "If what we see today is true, then Germany cannot win. Not against this, not against such plenty." The trucks rumbled deeper into the countryside, the fields swallowing the horizon. The prisoners whispered, "Was this truly captivity? Or a trick meant to soften them before harsher treatment?" Their destination came into view, a clearing ringed with pine, barbed wire glinting in the sun. Guard towers stood at the corners, but inside the fence were neat rows of wooden barracks, kitchens, and even a small chapel. This was not a dungeon. It was something far stranger, a place that looked more like a village than a prison. As the Germans were marched through the gates, some dared to wonder if perhaps captivity in America would be unlike anything they had feared. What none of them yet knew was that just beyond the wire, in the vast farmland of America, their real story was about to begin, a story of work, of unexpected kindness, and of secret friendships that would outlive the war itself. The chapter of captivity had opened, but it would not be the story they imagined. The trucks rolled through winding back roads, their cargo of weary prisoners staring out through wooden slats. Every mile carried them deeper into the American countryside, far from towns, far from railroads, far from escape. After nearly an hour, the convoy slowed. Ahead, beyond tall oak trees, stretched a compound bordered by barbed wire. Guard towers rose at each corner, their shadows cutting across the dust. The gates opened, and the prisoners caught their first glimpse of Camp Mexia, one of over 400 POW camps scattered across the United States. They expected crumbling barracks and squalor. Instead, the camp looked almost like a military village. Neat rows of wooden huts, a mess hall, even sports fields painted in chalk. Obergefreiter Rudolf Weber, a veteran of North Africa, later wrote in his diary, "We braced for hunger and chains. Instead, we were given blankets, soap, and uniforms marked PW. I wondered if I was still in the same war." The guards issued rations, explained rules, and most shocking of all, outlined rights under the Geneva Convention. Prisoners could write letters, receive medical care, and would be paid for labor. To men who had seen war's cruelty firsthand, it felt unreal. Inside the wire, daily life soon took form. Roll calls at dawn, work details assigned, inspections conducted. But also classrooms, libraries, and soccer games played under the watch of rifle-bearing guards. The prisoners learned that the YMCA had provided books, that Red Cross packages were distributed fairly, and that their captors enforced discipline, but not humiliation. Still, the wire loomed large. Freedom lay just beyond it, farmhouses, fields, orchards, but always out of reach. Guards reminded them daily they were still enemies, no matter how clean the barracks. Yet the geography of the camp told another story. It was no accident that Mexia and so many other camps were built in the heart of farmland. America's war machine did not only consume weapons, it consumed food. With young men drafted overseas, farms lacked the hands to harvest. Cotton rotted in the fields, wheat stood uncut, orchards sagged with fruit. The prisoners soon understood the truth. They had not been brought here merely to wait out the war. They had been brought here to work the land. At first, this prospect humiliated them. Soldiers of Rommel's Africa Corps reduced to farmhands in a foreign land. Some muttered about dishonor, others refused to pick up tools. But hunger, boredom, and long days behind wire had their own weight. Slowly, volunteers stepped forward for the first details. One prisoner wrote cautiously in a secret notebook, "If this is slavery, it is a strange kind. They promise wages. They give food. We will see what awaits in the fields." Beyond the fences, farmers waited. They had heard stories of the Germans, hard, disciplined, dangerous. Yet they also knew their harvest depended on these men. Soon the gates would open, and the soldiers of Hitler would step into American soil not as conquerors, nor as captives, but as laborers. And in those fields, the first cracks in old hatreds would appear. The morning whistle shrieked at dawn. Prisoners lined up at the gates, watched closely by guards. Trucks idled outside, waiting to carry them, not to factories, but into the heart of the countryside. The men climbed aboard in silence, some muttering bitterly, others staring at the horizon. None knew what awaited them beyond the wire. The convoy rumbled along dirt roads until it slowed beside vast fields of cotton and wheat. Farmers stood waiting, broad-shouldered men in overalls, weathered by sun and work, their eyes fixed on the soldiers of a former enemy. At first there was tension. The Germans expected curses, spit, perhaps even violence, but instead the farmers nodded stiffly and handed out gloves, hats, and jugs of water. One prisoner, Hans Linde, wrote later, "I thought I would be treated like an animal." Instead, the farmer's wife handed me a sandwich. She smiled as if I were her own son. I could not understand it. The guards positioned themselves at the edges of the fields, rifles slung casually over their shoulders. They knew the land itself would keep the Germans occupied, miles of crops to tend, acres of work to complete. At first, the prisoners fumbled. Cotton tore at their fingers, wheat stalks scratched their arms. Sweat poured down in the punishing Texas heat. But slowly, the rhythm of farm work returned, familiar to men who had grown up in rural Germany. By midday, the fields rang not with the clash of enemies, but with the ordinary sounds of labor tools scraping, stalks rustling, men shouting to one another in two languages. Then came a moment no prisoner had imagined. The farmer called for rest, and his family brought food. Bread, apples, pitchers of cool water were shared not just among Americans, but with the prisoners themselves. A guard watching wrote in his log, "The farmers sat them under the pecan trees and fed them like hired hands." I saw no hatred, only work, only men. Children crept closer, bold with curiosity. They tugged at uniforms, laughed at the prisoners' broken English, and begged to learn German words. Soldiers who had faced British tanks now found themselves teaching Guten Tag to American farm boys. Suspicion lingered on both sides. Farmers eyed the prisoners warily, and the Germans feared tricks. Yet each small gesture, an apple passed, a tool lent, a smile exchanged, chipped away at the wall of mistrust. One diary recorded a simple moment. "The boy gave me a peach, warm from the sun." I ate it and thought of my home in Saxony. For a moment, I was not a prisoner. I was only a man in a field. As the sun dipped low, the prisoners were marched back to the trucks. Their hands were raw, their muscles aching, yet something unspoken had changed. They carried no contraband, no stolen food, only exhaustion and the memory of kindness where they had expected only hate. For in that first day beneath the American sun, the seeds of something unexpected had been planted. Seeds of doubt, seeds of humanity, seeds that in time would grow into quiet, forbidden friendships. The war was still raging, but in the farmlands of Texas, a different kind of story had begun, one written not in gunfire, but in sweat, bread, and the fragile laughter of strangers. The work details soon became routine. Each morning, prisoners were marched out under guard, trucks carrying them to farms scattered across Texas and the Midwest. By evening, they returned dusty and exhausted, their hands blistered, their bodies sore. At first, meals were strictly divided. Prisoners ate government rations in the fields. Farmers ate in their kitchens. But slowly, the barriers began to soften. It started with small gestures. A farmer's wife brought a jug of cold milk. Another left a basket of peaches by the well. Then came sandwiches, pies, and sometimes whole dinners served outdoors beneath the shade of oak trees. For men who had grown used to the thin rations of the Africa Corps, the food was overwhelming: fresh cornbread, fried chicken, steaming potatoes, sweet preserves. One prisoner, Ernst Kappel, later recalled, "The farmer's daughter handed me a slice of pie. I tasted it and thought, this cannot be the America Goebbels spoke of. This is not decadence. This is abundance." At midday breaks, the prisoners sat under pecan trees with guards nearby, eating side by side with the farmers who had once looked at them with suspicion. Conversation was clumsy at first, but food bridged the silence. Children slipped between groups, trading words, laughing at the strange accents. They begged for German songs, and the soldiers obliged, their voices carrying over the fields like echoes of another world. The guards recorded the strangeness in their logs. One wrote, "It is peculiar. Farmers feed the prisoners as though they were hired hands, and the Germans, polite as ever, thank them. In those moments, I sometimes forget they were once enemies." In the barracks that night, the prisoners replayed the meals in their minds. For many, the flavors reminded them of home, of mothers baking bread, of sisters carrying lunch into the fields of Bavaria or Saxony. Yet even as they savored these memories, unease lingered. To To speak too openly of American kindness risked being branded disloyal by fellow prisoners still loyal to the Reich. So they kept their gratitude hidden, written only in secret diaries. By late summer, invitations grew bolder. Some farmers allowed a few trusted prisoners to sit on porches and eat with the family, guards standing discreetly aside. The sound of laughter sometimes carried across the yard as men once sworn to kill each other shared the same table. One German officer wrote in his notebook, "When I drank coffee from the farmer's cup, I felt the strangest thing, respect. Respect for an enemy who treated me not as a beast, but as a man." These meals blurred the lines that wire and uniforms tried to enforce. They did not erase the war, but they created spaces where war could not entirely intrude. Each shared loaf of bread, each jug of milk, became a quiet act of defiance. Defiance not against America, but against the idea that enemies would never be human to each other. The war was far away, but here in the fields, men discovered an older truth. Those who eat together begin in some small way to live together. And from these meals, something fragile but undeniable began to grow friendship, born not of politics but of hunger, kindness, and the breaking of bread. It was a transformation that no guard, no farmer, and no prisoner could have predicted. And it was only the beginning. By autumn, the farms of Texas and the Midwest echoed with more than the sounds of labor. A new rhythm had taken hold, one of words, songs, and laughter that neither guards nor propaganda could suppress. At first, communication between farmers and prisoners was nothing more than gestures, pointing at a tool, miming how to lift a bale of hay, nodding in thanks. But slowly, words began to slip through. Children were the boldest. They tugged at German uniforms, asking how to say hello or thank you. The prisoners taught them Guten Tag and Danke, their heavy accents sparking giggles from curious boys and girls. Soon the fields were filled with clumsy exchanges. A farmer corrected German attempts at English while the Germans laughed at farmers mangling German phrases. The soil itself became a classroom. One farmer later recalled, "I remember my son shouting Wasser every time he wanted a drink." The Germans laughed so hard they nearly dropped their baskets. That day they stopped being enemies. Evenings in the camp brought another kind of exchange music. As the sun sank, voices rose from the barracks. Folk songs of Bavaria, Saxony, and Prussia drifted across the wire. At first, the farmers listened from their porches, uncertain. But then, something unexpected happened. The Germans began singing American hymns in halting English, taught by guards and by memory of church services back home. One winter night, Silent Night rose from German throats in its original language. Across the fields, American families joined softly in English. For a moment, two nations at war shared the same carol. A diary entry captured the moment. I sang, and I felt no barbed wire, no guards, only voices, joined in one song. For a brief time, I Was Free music became the bridge. It carried laughter across fences, turned suspicion into smiles, and reminded both prisoners and farmers of the humanity that war had tried to erase. Even guards admitted they were moved. One wrote, "I caught myself humming along with the Germans tonight." It felt wrong, but also strangely right. By day, the fields rang with broken English and clumsy German. By night, the camps echoed with music. And through these simple exchanges, bonds of understanding took root. The children, of course, carried it furthest. They memorized songs, copied words into notebooks, and ran home to show their parents. Many would later say they learned their first foreign language from the very men their brothers were fighting overseas. The laughter of children and the sound of music were stronger than propaganda. They dissolved the image of the faceless enemy and replaced it with something far harder: to hate human voices, human songs, human joy. And as autumn deepened, both farmers and prisoners began to realize something dangerous. They no longer looked at each other as enemies. For in shared words and shared songs, a quiet truth had emerged, one that neither governments nor armies could erase. Enemies had begun to sound like neighbors, and neighbors, in time, could become friends. As the months passed, the prisoners sought ways to capture the strange reality of their captivity. They were allowed to write letters home, but every word was read, censored, and sometimes blacked out before it ever reached Germany. Most wrote cautiously, "I am well. The food is fair. I am healthy." But what they truly wanted to say, the kindness, the friendship, the humanity they had found, was too dangerous to risk. Instead, they turned to secret diaries, tiny notebooks hidden under bunks or folded pages tucked into boots. In these pages, the truth poured out words that could never pass through the censor's hands. Gefreiter Wilhelm Krauss wrote, "Today, the farmer's wife gave me bread, still warm from the oven. I thought of my mother, and for a moment I was home. This I cannot write to her. It would never be allowed." Another, Feldwebel Otto Meissner, recorded, "A boy shouted my name across the yard, proud to speak German. I smiled for the first time in months. How can I explain this in a letter? They would call me a traitor." These hidden words reveal a struggle deeper than barbed wire, the struggle between loyalty to the Reich and the undeniable reality of American generosity. Farmers noticed the silence too. They saw prisoners hesitate when spoken to, glance at guards before answering, or hold back laughter as if afraid it might betray them. One guard reported, "The Germans often ask if their letters are read in Berlin. They seem afraid to say too much. They want to speak well of America, but fear it will be twisted against their families." To cope, the prisoners invented codes. Long days meant farm work. Sunshine meant good food. Quiet nights meant safety. But the warmth of their treatment remained hidden between the lines. In the barracks, after lights out, they sometimes read aloud from their diaries entries, disguised as letters they wished they could send. It was their way of sharing the truth, if only among themselves. One prisoner ended his diary entry with a line that survived decades. "If my family knew how we are treated here, they would no longer believe the Reich's lies, but perhaps one day they will." When the war ended, many of these diaries traveled back across the Atlantic, hidden in suitcases and uniform pockets. Years later, historians uncovered them in archives, revealing voices silenced during captivity. But in 1943 and 1944, those words could not leave the camp. They lived only in whispered readings, in scribbles on yellowed pages, in the minds of men torn between two worlds. For while they lived in America's fields as workers and neighbors, they remained on paper Germany's soldiers, and paper had the power to condemn. The letters they never sent became monuments to an invisible truth, that the enemy had shown them dignity, and that the war's greatest weapon was not always a gun, but silence. And within that silence, seeds of change took root. Seeds that would soon grow into bonds even more forbidden, more dangerous, and more human than any diary could contain. For beyond letters and diaries, some prisoners discovered something that neither barbed wire nor censorship could contain: the stirrings of love. By late 1944, the camps had settled into a strange rhythm work: food, music, and diaries filled with secrets. But among the stories whispered in bunks and barns, some carried a dangerous edge. They were stories of glances exchanged in orchards, of letters passed in baskets, of something far more forbidden than friendship romance. Farmers' daughters. Their brothers, fighting overseas, sometimes worked alongside the German prisoners. A smile across rows of cotton, a laugh shared over a broken tool. The smallest gestures carried weight. One prisoner later recalled, "She poured me a drink of water." Our hands touched. It was nothing, and yet everything. For a moment, I forgot the wire, the guards, the war. Such encounters were rare, but impossible to ignore. Guards noticed. Reports mentioned too much familiarity between young women and prisoners. Commanders issued warnings. Punishments would be severe for those who crossed the line. But rules could not stop loneliness. Some towns whispered of barn dances where prisoners stood in shadows, tapping their boots to American music, while girls stole glances they could not explain. A German diary revealed one such night. There was music. For 2 hours, we were not soldiers, not captives, not enemies. We were young and the war was far away. But when the music stopped, reality returned. Some prisoners carved names into bunk walls, hiding tokens of affection in plain sight. Others carried secret photographs given in quiet moments. Most of these bonds remained unspoken, yet unforgettable. For the farmers, the conflict ran deep. Fathers saw hardworking men who labored beside them honestly, who ate at their tables politely. Could they forbid their daughters from seeing humanity where once they had seen only uniforms? One farmer admitted years later, "I knew my daughter had feelings for one of them. I forbade it, of course, but in truth I understood. They were boys, not monsters. How could she not see that?" For the Germans, these connections blurred everything they had been taught. They had come to America as sworn enemies. Yet here, in the quiet of farms, they discovered kindness and sometimes even love from those they had expected to hate them most. The risks were enormous. Discovery meant confinement, transfer, or worse, and yet the heart is stubborn in war. It finds paths even where barbed wire stands in its way. A prisoner's note, found decades later in an archive, carried only 6 words. "I love you." I cannot stay. These forbidden bonds rarely became more than glances, letters, or stolen words, but they revealed something more powerful than orders or propaganda. The human spirit's refusal to be confined. For even in captivity, even surrounded by fences and guards, some men and women discovered what no uniform or ideology could erase: the simple truth of human connection. And as winter approached, these fragile bonds, these whispered secrets, would be tested by a season that carried its own powerful traditions. For soon, prisoners and farmers alike would share in the most unlikely moment of all, the Christmas of 1944. December 1944. Across Europe, the war raged in blood and fire. In the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge unleashed chaos. In the East, entire cities burned in the snow. But in the American heartland, behind barbed wire and farm fences, a different story unfolded. For the German prisoners, Christmas approached. A holiday they had never expected to see so far from home, in the land of their enemies. The camps allowed modest decorations. Branches cut from nearby pines became makeshift trees. Paper stars folded from newspapers dangled from rafters. Candles, carefully guarded, glowed against the cold winter air. One prisoner wrote in his diary, "We hung twigs on a wall and called it a tree." It was enough to remind us that even in captivity, we were still men, still sons, still fathers. But it was not only inside the camps that Christmas took root. Farmers who had worked beside the prisoners for months now faced a question. Should they share their holiday tables with the very men their sons were fighting overseas? Some said no. The war was still raging. American blood was being spilled every day. But others felt something deeper compassion for the young men who, though enemies, longed for home just as their own sons did. And so, quietly, kindness crossed the wire. Families sent baskets of food, fruitcakes, pies, jars of preserves. Blankets, mittens, even books found their way into camps. Guards looked away. Christmas was stronger than regulations. One prisoner, Kurt Adler, later remembered. The farmer's wife gave me a slice of cake, wrapped in paper. I tasted it and thought of my mother. It was the sweetest thing I had known since Africa. In some towns, something even more remarkable happened. A few prisoners were invited into farmhouses to sit at wooden tables, eat turkey and potatoes, and hear carols sung by American children. A farmer described it years later. They were no different from our boys overseas. They were young, tired, far from home. War made us enemies, but Christmas made us neighbors. In the camps, Christmas Eve became a night of music. From the barracks rose Stille Nacht, sung in soft German voices. Across the wire, American families joined in English. For a moment, the two sides were one choir. A diary captured the moment. When we sang Silent Night, the guards did not stop us. For one night, the war ended. We were simply men, united by a song. Children pressed gifts through the wire handmade toys, knitted scarves, even marbles from their pockets. The prisoners gave back what they could: wooden carvings, drawings, and trinkets fashioned from scrap. These gestures, small as they seemed, carried power greater than propaganda. They were proof that humanity survived even